Hello and welcome back to class. In today's tutorial and demonstration video, we're going to be diving into the topic of Sumi ink. Sumi ink is a really wonderful and amazing material, especially for making tonal drawings or just having fun with mark and exploring what that wet media can do with value. So this is going to be a really great and exciting process. This video is going to be more catered towards landscape drawing, but I am also going to be talking about techniques that really can be used or applied to any type of drawing genre or medium that you choose. So feel free just to keep that in mind and have fun with this video. As always, feel free to stop, pause, or even rewatch the video as needed. I'm also going to be essentially breaking this video down into three main components. The first part of the video, part one, is going to deal with the history of Sumi ink. I'm just going to give you a little bit of context on not only the history and where it comes from, but also some of the material quality of Sumi ink, just so you have a better, well-rounded knowledge of what Sumi ink is and where it comes from. Part two of the video is going to dive into a series of just essentially examples of different marks and techniques that we might use or even think about approaching when working with Sumi ink. So this could be a really helpful part of the demo just to get you more comfortable or familiar with different processes or different brushwork and even different materials that you might want to think about using in tandem with your Sumi ink. The third part of the video is going to be a start to finish, essentially demo of a Sumi ink tonal landscape. So I'm going to essentially be making this particular work from start to finish. I'm going to start off with some drawing and then laying in some tonal works and then building up that tonal value and then ending with some more textural surface marks on top. So I'm going to talk to you throughout that process. That portion, or part three, is going to be time-lapse, so feel free to stop or even rewatch some sections too, just to see how I'm handling some marks and all that good stuff. So hopefully that sums it up. Let's go ahead and dive into the video. So let's go ahead and begin with some historical context and some foundation knowledge about the material of Sumi ink. First off, Sumi ink is considered to have developed from East Asian countries. Primarily, we can kind of consider this a monochrome type of painting style, which typically means that you're working with a black material of the Sumi ink. You create a series of black and white washes with just varying levels of Sumi ink to proportions or ratios of water, and then of course using the white of the page to give you your lighter values. So that's typically kind of the working style that we see with Sumi ink, just shades of black. All right, so typically when we're looking or talking about the canon of Sumi ink, we have to refer back to the amazing context as well as the rich history of Sumi ink in East Asia. Primarily, this medium is going to be mostly talked about in the context of Chinese and Japanese culture. We do see a little bit of it popping up in around 15 or late 14th century in Korea as well, but typically this is kind of considered a Chinese or Japanese type of painting material or medium. We see the first emergence of our Sumi ink artists and drawings around the Tang Dynasty in China, around 618 to 907. It really starts to become an active part of the painting canon in East Asia in the Song Dynasty in China, around 960 to 1279. Onward from that point, we start to see Japan really introducing Sumi ink, primarily due to a set of Zen Buddhist monks who introduce it to Japan in the 14th century. And like I said, somewhat later, we do start to become really aware of more Korean styles of Sumi ink developing in Korea, like I said, around later 14th century or even into the 15th century from that point on. In addition to that, we start to really see, like I said, in the Sung Dynasty, this kind of flourishing of the Sumi ink approach or Sumi ink drawings. Typically, we can kind of look at Sumi inks or Sumi ink drawings in this kind of vertical type of hanging scroll or a kind of horizontal hand scroll type of format. Of course, there's not only portraits in Sumi ink, but also types of calligraphy to match poetry and things like that, but also too in the large context of landscape painting. And in fact, that's really where we see two main schools of thought develop during this large period of time of Sumi ink production in East Asia. And really we start to see a kind of context of the northern school of thought and the southern school of thought. Now, like I said, I'm not going to fully dive into all of this or all of the artists that are associated with these schools, but I do like to reference this because this may be brought up in the future or in different art history classes or even books that talk about Sumi ink. The northern school of thought with handling Sumi ink tends to identify as a little bit clearer kind of garden type imagery. We often see really kind of elaborate spaces, very kind of graphic, somewhat in their distinction of forms, and also their kind of genre that they tackle, or tends to be a little bit more pastoral. We start to look at the southern school, which tends to be a lot more expressive and often is identified as a freer type of style. Often we'll see bits of large negative space, or kind of areas where the paint really blends into the paper and kind of bleeds off into space. Also, when talking about Sumi ink, it has this really rich and amazing history, not only tied into the context of the culture, but also the religion that is operating during those time periods as well, and is still very much a part of some of the religious, spiritual, and even psychological and even metaphysical kind of happenings about how art functions with humanity. So when often talking about Sumi ink drawings, you might hear two different terms. Those two terms are the Shin and the Najimi. So the Shin often refers to the brushstroke and how you might apply that to the page, whether that has more gestural forms, whether that has more of a scraggly kind of mark and or a textured mark. The Najimi often refers to how the spread of the ink maybe feeds into the type of paper. And this kind of gets into more of an Eastern philosophy on religion and also more cultural context. And this is, I think, where we really start to see abstraction playing out in a really beautiful way, in a really complex way with Sumi ink in the canon of Eastern art history. With that quality of the Shin and the Najimi. So when we're working with this, this could also be maybe something too that you're thinking about, where you're thinking about the sublime of nature, where you're perhaps thinking about the pastoralism of nature, how we might try to control or contain nature in these gardens or plots of land. Or you can think about your own significance in a landscape, how small you might feel or how large you may feel in the new context of the world with globalization. So you can start bringing some of these ideas of older kind of traditions with the Shin and the Najimi and how they might be thinking about brushstroke and brush quality and that feed of mark into a paper, or controlling that mark a little bit more. But this can all be good context for you to really think about how you approach the handling of the material in that context of the painting and the history in which that context is built off of. So that's just some good ways to think about this. So let's go ahead and dive into some context about material. We're gonna dive into this one just a teensy bit, but I want to just talk about some kind of traditional methods of working with Sumi ink with pressed blocks. We will not be working with these for this class. It's just much easier to work with kind of viscous liquid Sumi inks, so we're gonna go, and also cheaper. So we're gonna work with this one, but I do like to talk about this just in case you have some questions. Now, traditionally, you can buy them in these kind of traditional pressed blocks. Essentially what you'll do is you'll buy a type of clay bowl or a porcelain basin that with a little bit of texture on top, not too rough or not like an aggregate, but really smooth, kind of just soft texture. And then essentially you're going to pour some water into that small bowl or basin, and then essentially work in a rotating fashion until you get your desired black material of the Sumi ink to be liquefied. That is typically a longer process. It's a little bit harder and tends to be a teensy bit more expensive because this is a compressed material. And often when they're compressing this material, there's a lot more handmade qualities and a lot more nicer artisan grade products going into this type of material and process. So that's one of the reasons we're not doing it either. But we're going to be working with this lovely Sumi ink material. So let's go ahead and look at some context for this. So Yoshitomo's kind of Sumi ink is a really great artistic grade and artistic quality Sumi ink that's primarily designed for calligraphy and Sumi ink paintings. Yoshitomo's brand particularly is made from a high vegetable soot, burnt soot kind of product. So that means they're taking vegetation and then they are burning that down into a very very high degree kiln. They get the ash that is left over from that. They grind it down into a very fine black powder. Then that is mixed with a lacquer or shellac, and then a little bit of water. So that's primarily what's going to make up our Sumi ink. Traditionally, Sumi ink has been made from pine needles or animal products, and then it's mixed with a gelatin, like I said, an animal product, and then a little bit of water for kind of a viscous Sumi ink. For the block or pressed forms, we can see a type of soot black material such as lamp black, or like I said, those burnt pine needles pressed into some type of binding agent like animal gelatin, or even a shellac or lacquer type of finish, then pressed into a block form like this that then you have to rehydrate with water. But for us, we're just going to be working with this, so it's going to take out some of the guesswork and some of the labor that our block forms will cause. This is a great product. Typically when I work with this, I will work directly with the black ink for my darkest values, and then I will pour a little bit of black ink and then kind of give myself different ranging water ratios for that black ink in smaller cups, just so I can give myself a variety of different washes to work with. That way I can kind of give myself tonal range from black all the way to my paper being white, and then work with those values in between. So you're going to see me doing that throughout the video, and I highly encourage you to work with tonal values and not just directly with your Sumi ink, because it'll help you understand value systems a little bit better. In addition to that, we're going to go ahead now and switch gears here. We're going to dive into part 2 of the video where we talk about how we might think about using Sumi ink, some different techniques to apply or use, brush treatment, brush handling, and also additionally diving into some materials that you'll need for this assignment, as well as some additional materials that might be helpful for aiding you in Sumi ink and just expanding that knowledge on Sumi ink a little bit further. So let's go ahead and dive into part 2. So diving in, we're going to just go over some quick materials for working with Sumi ink. Now for this particular project, most likely we're going to be working with a cold press 140-pound watercolor paper. Now typically when I recommend watercolor papers for any type of wet media source, I always recommend 140 pounds or higher, primarily just to help you with securing your paper to a board and making sure that that ripple won't be too severe. Because no matter how thick your paper is or even how good a quality your paper is, when working with wet media and paper, you will have a little bit of lift or expansion on your paper. So you want to make sure that that heavier grounded paper will be able to be flattened back out. So that's why I always recommend 140 pounds or higher. There are additional types of watercolor paper that we're going to talk about really quickly. Our hot press watercolor paper is going to have a much smoother finish. So I'm not sure if you're able to totally pick up the grain maybe in this paper on the video, but there's a little bit of grain to this, but mostly it's a pretty smooth paper. So that's kind of indicative of most hot press papers. You're going to have a smoother surface. For other types of paper like cold press, you might be able to see maybe the tooth or surface on this one. It's quite textured and it's really almost quite rough to the touch. This is pretty indicative of cold pressed watercolor paper. So if you're more interested in kind of a rougher mark or having a little bit more grip or tooth to your paper, I might recommend in the future working with a cold press like this. In addition, there's also other types of papers that you could work with, particularly things like printmaking paper. We have Canson paper and some BFK here. So both of these, Arches cover and then a BFAK or a Reeves BFK paper. Both of these are really great water paper or water media friendly papers. They are used in printmaking or traditional printmaking methods, so they're going to hold up really well. They're strong in terms of just their durability and their flexibility, and you can actually get some really beautiful kind of marks on these papers as well. And then the last thing are traditional mulberry papers. This is actually a type of hosho paper where it's like a rice type paper. And this is actually a very traditional paper used in watercolor Sumi ink for Japanese and Chinese landscapes or calligraphy paintings. So mulberry papers are really strong fibers, but they're incredibly thin. So this is going to have a very different feel and a very different effect than our watercolor papers. There's no sizing agent in mulberry papers typically. So, you know, that's going to be also a difference to chemically and formally on how they function or work. For mulberry papers, we actually go about working with them in a very different fashion. Traditional methods actually have you securing a towel under a board or a paper towel or towel under a board or surface that you're working on. You don't tape down the paper at all, and rather you just work directly on top of it. And when we were talking about those different kind of mark qualities that you can get, with Sumi ink and mulberry paper, especially kind of that bleed, that's actually kind of a prized kind of feature about a lot of mulberry papers. So if you're more interested in kind of traditional Chinese or Japanese landscapes or calligraphy or even portraiture work, this might be a paper that you might want to try out in the future. If you have any questions or if you want to learn more about this, just let me know and we can have our own kind of conversation and I can talk you through that process too. All right, so we're going to go ahead and just use actually a little sample paper of our cold press 140-pound watercolor paper. I'm going to go ahead and tape down these sides, and then we're going to start talking about ways to think about marks and give you some basic techniques on working with Sumi ink. All right, so our paper's all taped down. I'm going to go ahead and just introduce some basic kind of qualities and techniques for talking about Sumi ink. So we're going to start off actually with just talking about some water. Normally when I'm working with Sumi ink, I usually have 2 large containers of water. So these are most likely going to be sitting in the frame or off the frame. One usually is for cleaning, the other one is just for like extra cleaning. Primarily I try to keep my tinted or my clean water for cleaning, a little bit on the cleaner side. So I just usually normally kind of dip the brush in to get it wet and then wipe off excess material on a paper towel off to the side. And then I'll kind of dip it back in and then re-clean off that brush. This is kind of more of like a traditional thing with working with Sumi ink, but also too, this kind of toned water or the kind of cleaning water will actually become toned in the future, and you can use this actually as a light kind of tone to lay down on your paper as well. So just keep that in mind as you're working. When working with Sumi ink, as I mentioned, I create a series of values or tones that I work with in little containers. These are just some of those containers that I work with. They're basically, and you can see some of the dried up old Sumi ink in some of them too. They're basically just Tupperware sauce containers that you get from takeout, and I just save them and reuse them. If you don't have any containers like these, feel free to use any kind of small glass dishes or any kind of Tupperware that you might have at home. Just make sure to clean them out really well before you use them. You don't want to consume any type of Sumi ink, or if you have any old dishes or even a really large like styrofoam plate where you can make some smaller kind of washes within that plate or in that zone, then you can work with that directly with your Sumi ink. You could also use things like a palette if you have a glass palette, or even disposable palettes too. Just remember, you won't be able to make large batches because you'll be working on a flat surface if you decide to go on a palette route. So that's also an option for you too. But I'm going to be working with a variety of different tones for my Sumi ink. This is pretty basic in terms of how I use this. What I'll just do is take out my bottle of Sumi ink, and I'll just pour directly from the bottle into one of my containers. And I'll actually have this sitting off to the side as like my black. And I will then start to use maybe a brush, and I'll load that up with material and then actually just dip that into one of the mediums themselves. And of course, this is just water and ink that I'm mixing together. And then that'll actually give me a toned surface to work off of. I'll then test that tone on spare pieces of paper. Normally when I'm working with Sumi ink, I try to go with anywhere between 5 to 6 different values, just to give me a little bit of a working kind of understanding of those values and give me a baseline. And then of course I can go in between those values in some areas, or I could work with layering. This is a pretty dark value that I made. It's not totally black, but as you can see, it's pretty dark. So I might want to make actually a value maybe in between these two, because I'm thinking that's what I might need. So also this is a good check too as well, just to see how your Sumi ink value-wise is going to hold up. And this is going to be one of our first tips that we talk about with Sumi ink. Sumi ink is always going to appear darker when you first apply it to the page compared to when it dries. So when this dries, this is actually going to be a lighter value than when I applied it. So that's also going to be a good gauge for learning how to see and understand and work with Sumi ink. You're going to also need a variety of paper towels for this. And when I say a variety, I just mean a lot of paper towels, because you'll be most likely cleaning off brushes, and then also maybe even working with your paper towels in the future. To clean off your Sumi brush, I just essentially like to work with it with the water, and I'm just slowly dipping it in. I'll bring it on screen here just so you can see. And then I'll just kind of slowly clean it up like this. The reason I don't like to just do this with my brush is primarily because it dirties up my water a lot. Now, if you are working with a synthetic brush like I am, that might actually be one of the only ways you can actually clean it, and that's when your two container water system is going to become really handy, just because you're gonna go through water or clean watering bins pretty quickly. So after you've got most of the Sumi ink cleaned out of your brush, you're going to go ahead and then we're going to start talking about some different techniques. Always keep, like I said, some scrap pieces of paper around. I actually have quite a bit of these that I use quite frequently when I'm ever working on a big project, just to figure out how marks are going to appear on the page, how I might want to treat the Sumi ink, how lines or tones or values might work, or how I might stack those lines, tones, or values together, okay? So make sure you always have some extra square scraps or extra additional scraps that you can play around with, just so you understand the marks and values properly. And you're going to see me doing that in part 3 of this video when I'm making my larger landscape Sumi ink drawing. You're going to see me bringing in a scrap piece of paper, figuring out the marks, figuring out the tone before I actually apply it to the page. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about one of the most important rules for Sumi ink. So now we understand that our value is always going to dry a little bit lighter than when it goes on to the page. We have that kind of base operation now. Let's talk about how we actually maintain white. White is going to be kind of the thing that we're really going to have to keep an eye on. Essentially, the way we see white or the way we get white in a Sumi ink drawing is by the page. So to leave an area exposed, we're going to have to think or pre-plan some of our drawing. If there's areas of really light value or white, you're going to have to plan out where that white space is going to go, okay? So remember, once we place a dark value down, there is no lifting up that color or lifting up that value again. There are some ways that we can lift up ink, but there's no way to get back to 100% white once we put a value of our Sumi ink down, okay? So that's going to also be a really important part. You're going to also want to think about, too, making sure that you have your value scale in front of you so you can properly identify values that exist in the landscape. I did give you a really great handout for how to see value in terms of still lives and also in terms of landscapes. I give you some actually really good tips on how to identify like 0 through 10 on a value scale and where they might sit within a landscape space. So there's actually some really good tips there on just identifying value. Most likely you're not really going to see true paper white or 0 white on a landscape in front of you. Of course, there's always exceptions to the rule, but most of the time you're actually going to be seeing maybe a 1 or a 2. And I mean that quite seriously. So even in my landscape that I have, I don't actually leave any exposed paper. I actually put a toned ground on my whole entire sheet of paper before I start. So just keep that in mind too. Most of the time, if you do mess up and maybe go over your white a little bit, you can lift up some of the ink with your paper towel and just have a lighter value sitting there, okay? All right, so let's go ahead and talk about maybe 2 main techniques that we're going to talk about. I'm going to be working with a variety of different brushes for my demo in part 3 of this video, and also for this section in part 2 where we're talking about materials and mark making and all that good stuff. I'm going to be also using some synthetic brushes, such as this synthetic sable and then my white hair synthetic brush. These both are going to do different things. We're going to have traditional like Sumi Ink brushes or Sumi Ink bamboo brushes. I'm not going to be using any bamboo brushes. That's actually what I'm having you guys work with. But this is actually the hair that's in a Sumi Ink bamboo brush. So you're going to be able to see what the difference is just between these 2 kind of characteristics. And then also a watercolor brush or traditional watercolor brush for washes. So both of these are going to simulate essentially what a Sumi Ink bamboo brush is going to look like, which is what I recommended you guys to buy for this course. All right, so we're going to go ahead and talk about 2 techniques, wet on wet and then wet on dry. So wet on wet is actually talking about where you take an area of your paper and you wet it with material such as water or a light value, a very, very light value. And you're just going to paint in over that section. Now, of course, this is just white or clear water that I'm painting on. I'm just essentially opening up the pores of my paper and creating a wet ground. And then you're going to be able to work or load up a brush with material and then work on a wet surface. So that's what wet on wet means. It just means that you are working with wet material on a wet substrate. And you're going to be able to see how the kind of difference looks here. You're going to see some of that bleed as well. Wet on wet, you can do a lot of interesting things in terms of techniques. You can have a lot of different bleeding effects. You can watch maybe too how the ink spreads on a surface, and maybe even draw some really interesting, beautiful kind of trees, or even kind of like these little flower spots as well. You can really develop some very interesting blending, soft blending techniques here too. And even splatter that surface just to give you, like I said, some interesting texture. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about wet on dry. All right, what I'm going to do now is work on a dry surface and work with wet material. So I'm going to just load up my brush. Already you can see I just dipped this in and this instantly got loaded up with my brush here. And this is wet on dry. So already you can probably tell a big surface quality texture difference. You can work, of course, back into this on wet, but wet on dry is typically going to be a little bit more smooth in its application. It's not going to have as many value gradients. Like I said, with wet on wet, typically you go back in and work over that, so you can get a lot of that kind of blending or that kind of ink spreading into the space. But wet on dry is essentially, like I said, just working with a wet brush or wet material on a dry surface. So you're going to have a lot of clean lines, a clean application of just value or creating even planes of value. So both of these can actually be useful techniques for either creating texture. Perhaps this is a ground in which you can work on and add later kind of elements like trees and things like that too in the future. This also could be a really great technique to use for water landscapes. If you have like a scene or a section of water, you might want to try wet on wet. If you're working with hillsides or a lot of rolling mountains or skies, wet on dry might be a good technique too, just to lay down really flat, even planes. And to be perfectly honest, it really just depends on what your aesthetic is or how you want to picture your landscape or draw your landscape. Either one of these can be used in multiple situations and not just limited to those two examples that I gave for each. So feel free to experiment or feel free to experiment and have fun with these two techniques and how you might apply them or where you might use them or sub them out for one or the other, okay? All right, so that's gonna be our basic kind of introduction to the two techniques that we're really gonna be thinking about through the class. Wet on wet and then wet on dry. Now, in that kind of genre of wet on wet and wet on dry working methods, we can also think about mark and texture. Laying down grounds like this will be really helpful for our landscape, particularly when we're really thinking about how we want to develop a landscape or how we might want to have things function in it. So we might have areas where we lay down darker planes and lighter planes, and then we go back over top and then build up that layer and value even further in the future. And then maybe even going in and adding more detail sections later on, okay? So really thinking about value planes is going to be absolutely critical for this whole entire process. So start with these kind of ground planes and then build up on that value, and then till we get to the very end where we add that surface texture or mark a little bit more. So getting into the mark, so let's talk about that. There's a variety of different ways that we can create and generate marks for Sumi ink. The brush can be manipulated and handled in a variety of different techniques, different ways, the way from where we hold the brush in a tight position closer to the handle, the way that we hold maybe the brush in the middle and cradle it in our palm, or even hold it all the way back at the end of the brush, or just the different angles in which we can apply it. Even too, standing up will give you different types of marks. So think about how you're relating to the brush, and also the angle in which your body is relating to the brush or you're holding the brush. So when I'm making marks, typically, like I said, I'll have these like extra square sheets or little rectangle extra sheets laying around just so I can think about different marks that I can make. And this is going to be really helpful for me just to kind of test out different ideas or things. So I'm going to go ahead and just talk about a couple different brushes and maybe different effects, and also just give you some different examples of marks that you can add. So our traditional Sumi Ink brushes or Sumi Ink natural fibered brushes are going to have some really great qualities. They're going to have this ability to be really able to be modeled and molded. So what I mean by that is you'll be able to really kind of draw with an exact point because the fiber and the hair is so flexible and adapted to pick up a lot of materials such as the ink. You're going to be able to mold that quite sufficiently and actually be able to draw with it a little bit in terms of just creating really fine lines and even points with that mark. And you can get probably even thinner than this if you really want to. Work at a little bit higher angle. So you can create a variety of different thin marks actually with a very fat brush. And that's the reason I really love the Sumi Ink bamboo brushes. They're a traditional brush that's worked with Sumi Ink for a reason, because you can create really wide areas of planes just by flattening that brush out and dragging it across the surface, or you can work with it just on like that edge as I was showing you and create those really thin marks as well. So it's also too about that kind of breadth of expansion that you're using. Also, we can think about maybe even fanning the brush tips out a little bit so we maybe have more of a scraggly edge. And then we can think about maybe even speckling an area to give us texture to simulate grass or even waves if we're dealing with a landscape that has maybe a seascape kind of section to it. We can also think about maybe grasses, creating really scraggly marks that are really quick and fast acting. And layering this kind of grass mark to really feed into maybe the aesthetic of what maybe actually grass looks like. We can also think about too how maybe different sections might read in terms of grasses. Maybe large sections like this might be better suited for barns. This might actually make more of a grass mark. We can also think about too the kind of line quality. We can think about maybe even switching brushes and going to synthetics to create really lovely kind of passages where maybe our lines get really specific or our marks get really specific, and we can kind of have some kind of rounded edges to them. And think about to all of those drawing tips that we've learned over the past, thinking about how you can really create form just with mark and just with line. So you can think about creating hash marks also in this to give some extra texture, traditional hatch marks, cross hatch, right? And even thinking about those kind of parallel contour line hash marks to create a little bit more volume or form. This is a tonal drawing, so that means we are going to focus primarily on creating value tones and not as much as mark as a defining tool. So I do want you to think about that, but of course you can also have mark in this to create texture and to create value and to create form. So that's also going to be maybe some basic tips on just thinking about how to handle your brush and how to handle that material. And like I said, there's no necessarily right way to do it. There's maybe multiple ways that you can go about some things. You can work with your brush in a variety of different fashions in an opposite way too. That will actually give you an interesting mark. Instead of pulling the brush towards you, you can push the brush away to give you kind of staggered marks like this. As I mentioned, working with just different sized brushes will actually give you quite a bit of wonderful techniques and textures. So thinking about too, maybe even different angles of the brush where you're just maybe lightly poking down and creating a little bit of that stippled dot line to create even maybe some texture that you might see in a landscape or maybe even trees or something like that, okay? The big thing is too to really think about how you're going to be developing your mark. So when you start to lay down a ground, maybe your value isn't dark enough, go ahead and check your value when it's dried, and then see if you need to go and add another layer of value to that before you start adding any of these great detail marks. All right, so this is going to be like a basic little demo and overview on maybe different ways that you can handle your marks and create some different types of textures to help simulate some of those natural forms that you might see in nature. Let's go ahead and maybe talk about some additional materials that we can add into our Sumi ink to kind of advance or to even add in some different characteristics. One of those kind of forms are going to be some micro liners. Micro liners are really, really great for essentially just creating some interesting values, as well as some texture and also line work. It's essentially a felt tip ink pen, but you can go in and be able to kind of add in some kind of light characteristics. Like I said, especially if you're working with grasses, that lovely kind of brush mark is going to be able to give you some really light kind of moments where the paper is showing through. But also if you go back over with that ink pen, you're going to be able to get some really nice little low light sections too, where it feels like more the texture of grass. You can also go over large planes too and add stippling in some areas if you would like. Just to create some value. So you can have some really nice kind of forms floating in the distance, or even maybe go in and add a little bit more of detailed forms and adding in some of that lower light value or darker valued forms to the bottom. All right, in addition to that, you can probably also add, like I said, some cross hatching to this if you want, or even some hash marks. The big thing is I really want you to focus in on creating a large value plane. So work with your values first before you add any kind of detail marks with your pens. And like I said, this is really just to kind of help enhance or add some different textural qualities to the surface. So I want you to think about that, and I don't want you to outline in particularly a tonal drawing, which is what we're working on right now. So if we're not working on a tonal drawing, you can ignore that. But if we are working on a tonal drawing, I definitely maybe don't want you to outline anything, okay? So think about that quality and just make sure you're remembering that as we go along here. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and also talk about some other materials, such as adding white charcoal, white Conte, or white colored pencil. So these essentially three materials can add a lot of beautiful quality to your work. And as I mentioned, when we're working with Sumi ink, the big goal here is to really think about working from lightest value to darkest value. So you really want to maintain that white value of the paper as long as you can, or really be critical about where you're adding dark values and kind of go at it at a slower process, just because, like I said, you can't really take away or erase Sumi ink. You want to think about also maybe if you do go over an area, or if you want to add some white texture back, using some materials, like I said, with the Conte, the charcoal, or a white colored pencil. The white colored pencil is probably going to be the least effective. Typically, that's kind of how I think about it, as being the most. It has some nice kind of light qualities to it, but it also is has a little bit of value. As you can see, it's starting just to bring back a really nice subtle gray and just toning this space a little bit. It's not going to totally give you back all of the white, but you can see where maybe it's adding in a little bit of that lighter value over top. So it can be pretty effective in terms of just adding some really subtle whites. Our Conte is going to be a really great material just to push in a lot of whiter value. I'm going to go to a different page because that's still a little light. You can see how maybe I tried some of that too over here. But our white Conte is actually going to be able to be a really nice little tool for us to bring back some of that white material, particularly maybe in clouds. This could be effective, or tree bark if you're working from a birch tree, or if you have birch trees in your composition. You can think about maybe even scattering some of that texture and kind of working in a positive to negative relationship, thinking about carving away or adding in this white material of the birch bark. So this could be a really effective tool and strategy. And as you can see, I was able to get some really hard marks and then also do some blending marks where I just took my finger or even a little bit of a Q-tip to blend some of that space together and create a little bit more of that form. So feel free to kind of go back and think about some of our drawing knowledge gained throughout the class and add in more mark, or even add some of these blending techniques in with our Conte or charcoal to give you this effect. I personally think the white charcoal actually is one of the more effective ones. As you can see, it just adds a lot of white material down on the page. It looks pretty similar to the Conte. I just think it actually holds up a little bit better, to be perfectly honest. Also too, it has, you know me, I'm partial to drawing with pencils, so it's got a really great control to it. And of course too, you can get into more of those sinewy marks to maybe even generate cloud spaces and all that good stuff. Of course, you can lift up this material or blend it as well, so feel free to do that with a Q-tip or blending stump, or even lift it up with a paper towel as well. The last little bit of tips and talks that we're going to do is thinking about maybe even adding a little bit of texture through paper towels. So we're going to talk about it in the context of lifting things up, as well as talking about adding texture with paper towel. So let's say we put some value down and oh my gosh, it's too dark. What do? Perhaps we go in with a paper towel. This could be damp if you would like, or just a dry paper towel, and lift up some of that information. So you can see the massive amount of material that it's actually able to lift up just by putting or pushing a damp paper towel into that surface. You can also use dry too. It's going to pretty much be the same thing. I think personally kind of the wet maybe even lifts up a teensy bit more. Maybe you could see a little bit of a value difference there. That's up to you. Or, you know, maybe test that out on your own and see if maybe you can lift up more on one of those areas. You can also think about too texture that maybe you start to create with your paper towel. So I just essentially just punched in a little bit of value there with my paper towel, and you were able to see that I got some really nice kind of subtle textures. So I'm actually going to just draw a little bit over here on the side as well, so I can just extend that mark out to give you a better example. So you can see I can create some actually really beautiful textures. Now you can of course draw or lift on the side with this to create maybe even sections of grass or hillside textures. Even like I said, some areas where maybe there's a barn or even like a lake or a little riverside where maybe some of that texture is kind of rough and kind of staggered. This could be a really kind of beautiful space. Even in mountain areas, this could be really quite beautiful and lovely, and even clouds. So there's a variety of different applications too, where you maybe take this and actually start to create some different speckling textures. Also, waiting to let that dry and then lifting it up a second time could also give you some different textures and different value ranges within that space. You could also let this dry or hit it with a hair dryer and then go back over with some additional coats and create this technique on multiple layers on multiple areas of that surface. Okay, so this is going to basically conclude our little section for our techniques, painting tips, and all that good stuff for working with charcoal, or excuse me, working with Sumi ink. So hopefully we've learned maybe some good techniques with brush strokes. Remember, wet on wet, wet on dry. We can once again see how that technique finally ends when it dries, how you can get some different marks with all of your brushes, just using different angles of them, using different sides, accessing the brush from different positions with your hand, or how you're holding it on the stock of the brush. Also, additional materials that you could use, such as our Conte, our charcoal, and then our white colored pencil, as well as blending stumps to kind of make effective tools for adding in white. And then also paper towels for lifting up material. So hopefully this was helpful. Remember, use those little trays for creating value, and use some of these techniques, and make sure to have plenty of these little tester sheets around so you can not only attain the proper value of your Sumi ink in front of you that you've mixed, but you can also get a good read for maybe how those marks might sit on the page before you apply them to your larger finished drawings. Okay? All right, so let's go ahead and dive into step 3, or part 3 of this video, where we talk about our lovely large-scale black and white Sumi ink landscape drawing. Let's go ahead and dive into part 3 of our video. Over on the right side of the frame, you'll be able to see my reference photo and a photo of me working. So I'm gonna go ahead and just have this be a time-lapse portion of the video. This is going to be a little bit on the longer side, around 40 minutes. So feel free to speed up in certain areas or re-go back and watch things if needed. What I'm going to do first for starting my Sumi ink landscape drawing is start with a tiling technique. We've talked about tiling techniques in the past. Essentially, I'm going to be able to create a outline drawing of all of the major forms in my composition with a tiling technique before I add any type of Sumi ink value or washes to the surface or front sections of the page. This is going to be really important because once again with Sumi ink, we really have to work from light to dark, meaning that we have to maintain lighter values before we add any darker content. So if you've ever worked with acrylic paint or oil paint, it's essentially going to be the reverse process. We want to maintain that white on the page as long as possible, or maintain lighter values first and prioritize those forms before we go darker with any material or washes. What I'm doing right now is I'm creating a 1/4 of an inch border around my page. What I'm doing now is creating a 1/4 of an inch border around my page. This is primarily going to be where my tape is going to secure my page down to my tabletop. And I'm also laying in some horizontal and vertical lines. These horizontal and vertical lines are going to lay some kind of foundation measurement marks for laying in the log on the right hand side and that large branch that's coming in on the top right hand side of my image. The reason I'm starting off with vertical and horizontal lines as a measurement tool is primarily because I have a lot of complicated forms in this particular landscape, aka that fallen tree is going to be a little bit difficult to draw. So I'm going to start on both the top left hand and bottom right hand side first. This is going to allow me to essentially create a framing device and kind of allow my forms to start essentially mapping in an area where I can work in with that kind of fallen tree structure. So remember, you always want to look at where objects are sitting next to the frame, and that actually is a really helpful way to kind of dive into more complicated subject matter, because once you play those outlining objects, aka outlining objects meaning that objects that are closer to the frame, you'll be able to start creating a space or understand how you'll be able to fit other objects inside the frame a little bit more comfortably. I also have some really complicated forms, particularly in this landscape view. I'm kind of going with the seascape here, and I've got a really great kind of strong horizon line that sits in the background, but I have a really complicated fallen tree structure with a lot of texture and branches, and also value that kind of disappears into some of the other waves in the background or starts to become a little bit confused with things that are sitting close to it. And also I have a foreshortened log on the right hand side of my image. So I'm going to actually start with my foreshortened log first. Primarily, like I said, I'm going to use these vertical lines and horizontal lines as a type of Mondrian grid line to figure how far that log extends into the picture plane and where it's being cropped on the bottom right hand side. Once I'm able to figure this out, then I'm able to really start structuring other larger forms such as the horizon line, the shoreline as the waves come onto the beach, and some of those other more complicated structures such as the fallen tree. So always start with a little more complicated forms and forms that are always going to be on the outlier of our pictorial spaces, because once we map those in, like I said, it's much easier to figure out where we can start to fit in or lay in those other materials or forms in our composition, such as my particular fallen complicated tree in the center. Other than that, I'm going to start just kind of start drawing in some forms, and I'm going to do this a little bit more gesturally. I am slowing down during this process because I'm getting to areas where they are a little bit more tricky and I want to space out that time and kind of look at it. I am going to have to redraw my tree form a couple of times. This may happen with you too. Just based on certain measurements that I'm doing when I'm eyeing those forms in and laying them down, and then I'm remeasuring them, I'm seeing some kind of incorrect forms. So make sure to also do those measuring techniques that we've been talking about all semester long, and make sure that your landscape is perceptually accurate. That's going to be a huge component for a large part of this drawing. And remember, since we are working with ink, it is going to be more difficult because we won't have that added advantage of being able to erase. So that's why we want to be able to create a tiling technique with an outline drawing. So then when we go in to lay our value ink washes on top, we'll already have a kind of map or a grid work on where we need to start laying in those value structures. And so after I get through my drawing process, I'm going to be able to lay in some of my washes. I'm going to go ahead and put some music on, and we'll dive back into some paint handling when we get to that section.
And start working on my washes at this point. So I'm gonna just grab a couple of sheets of paper here. I've already got some pre-mixed washes that I just did, and I'm just gonna test out my value tones and make sure they're in the right order, and also make sure that they're dark enough for what I'm wanting. This is gonna be helpful, once again, like I said, to give you a kind of pre-mixed value system, so you can go back and at least quickly add in some values right off the bat, and then if you need to edit those values or make different values in between your pre-mixed values in your cups, you can easily go back and do that. So I'm going to be working primarily with 5. I recommend working with 5, but you can also do 6 to 10. The more you do, probably the better off you'll be, to be perfectly honest. I'm just going to keep mine a little bit simple and work with 5. I'm also going to be pre-mixing or mixing in some other values as I go along throughout this process. I'm going to start off with just looking at some basic tones in my image. I'm actually going to be working primarily with a lot of areas of shadow. So I'm actually going to be writing in a little bit of B for black or darker kind of forms. So that's going to actually help me kind of keep myself organized, especially in the initial layering of values. You're going to watch me kind of put down a large kind of massive section of value here, actually just identifying some of those darker forms in my drawing. And remember, I am going to be working with a lot of value here, so this outline drawing is going to be completely disappeared by the time I have my full value washes kind of up to the value that I'm wanting them to be. I'm being careful to make sure that I'm not going over any white areas or areas that I want to keep more of a lighter value. But as you can see, I'm pretty much toning the whole entire surface of my page with a lighter gray. And as I mentioned before, it's going to be really rare when you actually come across a landscape that has a complete zero white kind of value operating in it. Even the lightest values in my sky and in the waves below are actually technically more like a 1, 2, or 3 in the value range. So I'm really not going to actually have any white that's in this image. I am going to go back and kind of slightly tone some of my waves that are over on the right hand side. So if those still look white to you, I am going to be going back and kind of fixing that and adding a little bit more darker value and a little bit more textural value since they're waves in the future. So just keep an eye on that as well when you're working to make sure that you're really looking and paying attention to the value range. I'm going to go in now and just add some darker highlights on where the shoreline is kind of meeting some of those waves. This is going to give me kind of a ground in which I can kind of start estimating my darker values that are laying on that pebbled kind of beach. And then I'm going to be also developing some values in the trunk. I'm going to really start adding in some nicer qualities of value into the sky.
and creating some nice gradients as I go along. I'm also going to be practicing on my spare sheets of paper here before I go in and add any types of marks or any types of larger value systems, just to make sure that my brush strokes, my values, and my forms that I'm going to be making have already been pre-figured out before I go to add them into the drawing. Once again, like I said, this is going to be really helpful just to figure out if I need to add texture, how might I add texture? Is it going to be better done with a pen or a piece of material such as Conte or charcoal, or is it going to be better to have just the brush and the wash do most of the work? So do take breaks too when you need to. I'm obviously taking a little bit of a break right now. Go stretch your legs. I am going to be sitting down for this demo. As I've mentioned, I really prefer, walking or standing so I can walk around and get some space for my drawing. I'm going to highly recommend, specifically with this drawing, you take some breaks and you step back from your drawing and you really look at it from afar, just so you can properly see those values. If you don't learn anything, I guess, or take away anything from this particular demo, that's the one thing I really want you to take away. Make sure you're stepping away from your drawing so you can really see that value, because you're not going to be able to see the value of your drawing or the overall composition without getting some distance from your work. I'm going to actually be using a blow dryer or a hair dryer in certain sections of my work to speed up the drying process. I'm also going to highly recommend that everyone do this as well. It's just going to be an easy way for you to speed up your value process and your painting process. So keep a hair dryer handy to kind of hit it with some heat, and then you can speed up that drying process pretty quickly. I'm going to go ahead and lay in some darker value right off the bat into my C space, and just kind of lay in those forms. When doing this, I'm kind of cutting into the line, so meaning that I am taking a loaded up brush with material, and then I am starting just under the line, and then slowly bringing my brush flat to that drawn line, and then I create a long stroke until it is starting to lose material. Then I kind of bring it below that line once again, and then essentially I'll try to cut back into that line and just repeat that process until I get a straight line across. If you're really worried about shaky hands, you could try some painter's tape too. I am going to caution you with painter's tape. If you are using painter's tape, sometimes it does have a really bad quality of tearing up paper pulp. So that's why I recommend just going really slow with the process and just trying to steady your hand the best you can. If you have a shakier hand or low blood pressure, just try to stabilize it maybe with your left hand if you're right-handed, and vice versa if you're left-handed. But I do know some people who have used some really light washi tape to kind of be able to create a surface that you can create a straight line, and it won't rip up the paper or paper pulp underneath. So just be cautious if you are going to tape anything down on the surface of your page. That can be a little bit tricky, especially with paper, and you don't want to rip up anything. I am being more delicate in some of the areas where I have branches. Some of my branches are going to be drawn in a little bit later with some ink. So I am going to kind of keep my eye on that space and try to maintain the white qualities and be really careful and just work slowly in those regions. I'm also noticing where the darker areas of my image are. I have some kind of trees or some kind of root systems that are over on the left-hand side that are almost complete black, as well as my leaves over on the top right-hand side, which are around an 8 or a 9 in value. I'm going to leave my leaves all the way to the very end, and I'm going to work with a really kind of heavy, dark valued ink for that section. But I want to go ahead and start laying down some of those values on the left-hand side just to give me kind of a base for where my darker values are going to sit. Then once I get done with that, I'm going to start on with my sky spaces. I'm going to actually start with kind of a layered tone. And then I'm going to actually build up this whole entire section with a series of layers, meaning that I'm going to start with applying a darker value and then go back over that section and repeat darker value applications multiple times till I get or achieve the right intensity of value in my sky and both my sea space. So I'm also going to recommend this as a tip too. If you are noticing that your value isn't dark enough, go ahead and apply more value on top. Like I said, working with Sumi ink can be a little bit more challenging just because you have to really pay attention to the lighter spaces and make sure that you're maintaining some lighter space integrity. So you don't want to go too dark too quick. So I'd rather have you build up a series of darker values to where you slowly maintain or slowly get up to your darkest value, rather than you just apply a really dark mark right off the bat and then realize it might be too dark, or you might have ruined maybe a section of white that's supposed to be a lighter value before. So just make sure you're working slow through this process. I am going to be using a lot of wet on wet techniques for my sky space and also my sea. So make sure too to kind of think about the techniques that you're using when working with your Sumi ink, that they best utilize the types of marks and the types of values and forms that are being presented in your image. You're going to see me too going back and forth with also the paper towel quite a bit. I've already done it quite a bit so far, where I'm just kind of lifting off certain areas of the ink. So don't be shy of using different materials to paint with and to also create texture or to even lift up some forms as well. I'm going to go ahead and start laying in my textured kind of rock ground, aka the beach. I'm going to start with a darker kind of shadow. This might look a little funny for the first kind of few minutes when I start working onto it, and really it's going to look a little bit funny probably all the way till I finish it. This is actually a really great tip for working with value. Start with just line in the larger kind of valued forms and then worry about the texture at the very end. In fact, this is going to be a really great tip for working with Sumi ink. Just focus on the value, and then when there's texture, add that in at the very end. That's what I'm going to be doing primarily with my beach. I'm going to create really a graphic kind of value system in the beginning, and then I'm going to go over it with a series of mid-tone washes to kind of darken the overall space as a whole. So this is going to be the easiest way for me to kind of handle this kind of valued space. And then at the very end, towards the kind of end of my drawing demo here, I'm going to add a little bit of texture with some ink pens and also some Conte, just to give a little bit of pop of lighter values and darker values as well. close to the end of our video. As you can see, I've really developed a large range of value in this particular landscape and started adding texture into the sea as well as the birch trees and the pebbled shore below. Feel free once again to stop, pause, or rewatch sections of this video to get a better understanding on how I'm making those marks. Right now, I'm actually laying down and practicing some tree marks and how I'm going to be able to create the leaf structures on the right-hand side of my image. So I'm going to, at this point, kind of shift gears here and start making more detail forms within my drawing. And as I said, you really want to think about adding detail marks or deeper values or even contrasting values, like working directly with really dark tone black inks or working directly with your Sumi ink towards the end sections of your drawing. Because once again, you want to establish a strong value structure and make sure that your values are correct before you add any type of detail work that you may have to reduce or go over again. It's just better to have that strong punch at the very top layer of your Sumi ink. So think about creating strong values underneath, layering those values multiple times when needed, and then adding that detail and marks at the very end. So I'm just going in right now and adding a little bit of detail sections, bumping up some of that contrast of some of the shadows below, adding some leaf marks. And once again, even some of these leaves that I'm creating, I'm actually going to go on top with an actual darker value to give them some kind of dimension and also show that reflecting light on the leaf forms themselves. So they're going to have some really nice dimensional light qualities, and this is going to be something that I ask you to really focus on too. How is the light working in your image? Are you going to have multiple tones of value placed down and kind of carve out that space by just layering multiple values on top of one on top of the other? Or is it going to be something where maybe you have to go in with another material such as your Conte or white charcoal to add a little bit of pop of light color in small little areas. I'm also going in right now and just taking a small detail brush, creating a little bit of these kind of staticky drippy marks. Some of those marks on the kind of fallen tree kind of base are kind of going to really simulate some of that kind of birch bark falling off or some kind of algae that's being either stuck to that tree, and then also some of those smaller leaf forms that are appearing underneath. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and add in some little highlighting lines of just darker value that I couldn't necessarily do with my brush with some of my micro liner pens. Once again, this is just a felt tip black ink pen that I'm just going on and I'm just kind of lightly adding in some little detail lines. Once again, you don't want to use any kind of line as an outlining in this drawing. I am just using these little detail marks just to give me a little bit of texture and to highlight some of those darker values where I had to be really delicate with my light value and save that space. But I didn't want to like ruin it with a brush in case I kind of stumbled. So that's why I'm just using a little bit of the ink pen here. I'm also actually being able to create a little bit of dot and texture too with just some small stippling around some kind of small textural bits of the drawing as well. So once again, use other materials when needed, but this again is a tonal kind of base drawing, and I'm going to highly recommend not outlining any kind of forms, but rather just work with value and then add texture in at the last bit. I'm going back in now. As you've seen, I've kind of developed some really nice kind of staticky marks on the waves, just taking my brush and kind of stippling on those edges to create a really kind of static mark to indicate that kind of active line of a wave. I'm also going in now and kind of using some of my Conte as well as my charcoal pencil to go in and give me a little bit more details of white pop on the pebble stone below and add some of that highlight of the water reflection on the water surface. I'm also going back in certain areas and darkening some forms up, adding some details into the pebbles just with darker values. Notice how I'm also kind of using my paper on the side to create marks and also using my paper towel as kind of a dabbing tool to lift up some of that material a little bit more as well. So once again, too, this is a wonderful process of Sumi ink. Sometimes they can be a little bit more time intensive, and that's why I'm asking too, if you need to hit it with a hairdryer, feel free to do that. Plan out your drawing, but really pay attention to the values and how you're building up value form in your actual drawing. If you need to go over those forms multiple times, that's fine. I'd rather have you get the drawing correct and take your time through it rather than you kind of stumble along and realize you made a mistake somewhere in the process because you were trying to rush it. So work with the value, see the form, and kind of create that value in a natural way to create that real lovely darker forms on top. I do have a little bit of a line that I'm adding back in, or a little bit darker lines to the sky as well as my seascape, just not quite dark enough. So I'm going to go ahead and add that in. There is a little bit of reflecting light on the left-hand side of my image, so it's actually looking a little bit lighter than actually what it is. So some of the wet ink, you can just see me putting my hand over it too, it's kind of reflecting a little bit of white light back from my overhead lighting.